It is an early October day in 1873. 4 quiet figures on horseback pick their way along the trail. They are heading where few women have ever gone, up the trail to explore the American Matterhorn, Long's Peak, south of the frontier town of Estes Park in the Colorado Territory. One rider is a mountain man, Rocky Mountain Jim Nugent. Another is a 41-year-old, 4'11" tall Englishwoman, Isabella Bird, continuing to live out the prescription of her doctor that travel would improve her health. Riding with them are 2 young men who had guided her up from Longmount, as it was then called. One is Sylvester Spellman Downer, who would later become a judge in Boulder, and the other is Platt Rogers, who would one day be mayor of Denver. Writing later to her sister Henrietta, Miss Bird described her perception of this mighty mountain.
Long's Peak blocks out one end of Estes Park and dwarfs all the surrounding mountains. From it on this side rise, snowborn, the bright St. Vrain and the Big and Little Thompson. By sunlight or moonlight, its splintered grey crest is the one object which, in spite of Wapiti and Bighorn, Skunk and Grizzly, unfailingly arrests the eye. From it come all storms of snow and wind, and the forked lightning plays around its head like a glory. It is one of the noblest mountains, but in one's imagination it grows to be much more than a mountain. It becomes invested with a personality. In its caverns and abysses, one comes to fancy that it generates and chains the long winds to let them loose in its fury. The thunder becomes its voice, and the lightnings do it homage. Other summits blush under the morning kiss of the sun and turn pale the next moment, but it detains the first sunlight and holds it around its head for an hour at least, till it pleases to change from rosy red to deep blue, and the sunset, as if spellbound, lingers latest on its crest. The soft winds which hardly rustle the pine needles down here are raging rudely up there around its motionless summit. The mark of fire is upon it, and though it has passed into the grim repose, it tells of fire and upheaval as truly, though not as eloquently, as the living volcanoes of Hawaii. Here, under its shadow, one learns how naturally nature worship and the propitiation of the forces of nature arose in minds which had no better light.
On the sudden advice of Griff Evans, who had previously dissuaded her, Miss Bird decided to give Long's Peak a try, though it was late in the season and the winds were strong.
Mountain Jim came in and said he would go up as guide, and the 2 youths who rode here with me from Longmont and I caught at the proposal. Mrs. Edwards at once baked bread for 3 days. Steaks were cut from the steer, which hangs up conveniently, and tea, sugar, butter were benevolently added. Our picnic was not to be a luxurious or well-found one, for in order to avoid the expense of a pack mule, we limited our luggage to what our saddle horses could carry. Behind my saddle I carried 3 pair of camping blankets and a quilt, which reached to my shoulders. My own boots were so much worn that it was painful to walk even about the park in them. So Evans had lent me a pair of his hunting boots, which hung to the horn of my saddle. The horses of the 2 young men were equally loaded, for we had to prepare for many degrees of frost.
Jim Nugent and the Welshman Griff Evans are well-known characters in Estes Park, and often at odds. Isabella Bird describes Jim.
Jim was a shocking figure. He had on an old pair of high boots with a baggy pair of old trousers made up of deer hide, held on by an old scarf tucked into them. a leather shirt with 3 or 4 ragged, unbuttoned waistcoats over it, an old smashed wide-awake from under which his tawny, neglected ringlets hung down, with his one eye, his one long spur, his knife in his belt, his revolver in his waistcoat pocket, his saddle covered with an old beaver skin from which the paws hung down, his camping blankets behind him, his rifle laid across the saddle in front of him, his axe, canteen, and other gear hanging to the horn. He was as awful-looking a ruffian as one could see. By way of contrast, he rode a small Arab mare, of exquisite beauty, skittish, high-spirited, gentle, but altogether too light for him, and he fretted her incessantly to make her display herself.
They journey south of Estes Park into the mountains, past the Lake of Lilies, and on until they begin to take in majestic views of the peak itself.
Looking east, gorges open to the distant plains, then fading into purple-grey. Mountains with pine-cloth skirts rose in ranges or, solitary, uplifted their grey summits, while close behind, but nearly 3,000 feet above us, towered the bald white crest of Long's Peak, its huge precipices red with the light of a sun long lost to our eyes. Close to us, in the cavern side of the peak, was snow that, owing to its position, is eternal. Soon the afterglow came on, and before it faded, a big half-moon hung out of the heavens, shining through the silver-blue foliage of the pines on the frigid background of snow, and turning the whole into fairyland.
They make camp in a grove of trees below tree line.
Unsaddling and picketing the horses securely, making the beds of pine shoots and dragging up logs for fuel, warmed us all. Jim built up a great fire, and before long we were all sitting around it at supper. It didn't matter much that we had to drink our tea out of the battered meat tins in which it was boiled, and eat strips of beef reeking with pine smoke without plates or forks.
Jim is a gentleman, though that could not be said for the 2 lads from Longmont. Jim sends his dog Ring to lay down beside Isabella to keep her warm. The lads sing songs. Jim sings the Star-Spangled Banner and the Red, White, and Blue, recites a poem of his own composition, then tells some Indian stories. After a last tending to the horses, Jim builds a big fire since it is 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and Miss Bird makes a private bed among silver spruces with the dog Ring lying against her back to keep her warm. She cannot sleep.
I was anxious about the ascent, for gusts of ominous sound swept through the pines at intervals, then wild animals howled, and Ring was perturbed in spirit about them. Then it was strange to see the notorious desperado, a red-handed man, sleeping as quietly as innocence sleeps. But above all, it was exciting to lie there, with no better shelter than a bower of pines on a mountain 11,000 feet high, in the very heart of the rocky range, under 12 degrees of frost, hearing sounds of wolves, with shivering stars looking through the fragrant canopy, and with arrowy pines for bedposts and for a night lamp the red flames of a campfire. Today dawned long before the sun rose, pure and lemon-coloured. The rest were looking after the horses, while one of the students came running to tell me that I must come and farther down the slope, for Jim said he had never seen such a sunrise. From the chill, grey peak above, from the everlasting snows, from the silvered pines down through the mountain ranges with their depths lidden purple, we looked out to where the plains lay cold, in blue-grey, like a morning sea against a far horizon. Suddenly, as a dazzling streak at first, but enlarging rapidly into a dazzling sphere, the sun wheeled above the grey line, a light and glory as when it was first created. Jim involuntarily and reverently uncovered his head and exclaimed, "I believe there is a God." I felt as if, Parsi-like, I must worship. The grey of the plains changed to purple. The sky was all one rose-red flush on which vermilion cloud streaks rested, and the ghastly peaks gleamed like rubies, and the earth and heavens were new created. Surely the Most High dwelt not in temples made with hands. For the full hour those plains simulated the oceans, down to those limitless expanse of purple cliffs, rocks, and promontories swept down. By 7 we had finished breakfast and passed into the ghastlier solitudes above. I, riding as far as what, rightly or wrongly, are called the lava beds, an expanse of large and small boulders with snow in their crevices. It was very cold. Some water which we crossed was frozen hard enough to bear the horse. Jim had advised me against taking any wraps, and my thin Hawaiian riding dress, only fit for the tropics, was penetrated by the keen air. The rarefied atmosphere soon began to oppress our breathing, and I found that Evans's boots were so large that I had no foothold. Fortunately, before the real difficulty of the ascent began, I found, under a rock, a pair of small overshoes, probably left by the Hayden exploring expedition, which just lasted for the day. Just as we were leaping from rock to rock, Jim said, "I was thinking in the night about your travelling alone, and wondering where you carried your derringer, for I could see no signs of it." On my telling him that I travelled unarmed, he could hardly believe it, and adjured me to get a revolver at once. Passing through the notch, we looked along the nearly inaccessible side of the peak, composed of boulders and debris of all shapes and sizes, through which appeared broad, smooth ribs of reddish-coloured granite, looking as if they upheld the towering rock mass above.
As Miss Bird surveys this broad expanse from the notch, which we now call the keyhole, she is overwhelmed, not only by the vast beauty laid out before her, but by the daunting peril ahead of her on the ledges.
Never to be forgotten glories they were, burnt in upon my memory by 6 succeeding hours of terror. You know I have no head and no ankles, and never ought to dream of mountaineering. I had known that the ascent was a real mountaineering feat. I should not have felt the slightest ambition to perform it. As it is, I am only humiliated by my success, for Jim dragged me up like a bale of goods by sheer force of muscle. At the notch, the real business of the ascent began. 2,000 feet of solid rock towered above us. 4,000 feet of broken rock shelved precipitously below. Smooth granite ribs with barely foothold stood out here and there. Melted snow, refrozen several times, presented a more serious obstacle. Many of the rocks were loose and tumbled down upon touched. To me, it was a time of extreme terror. I was roped to Jim, but it was of no use. My feet were paralysed and slipped on the bare rock, and he said it was useless to try to go that way, and we retraced our steps. I wanted to return to the notch, knowing that my incompetence would detain the party, and one of the young men said almost plainly that a woman was a dangerous encumbrance. But the trapper replied shortly that if it were not to take a lady up, he would not go up at all.
By force of will, Jim is determined to get Miss Bird to the top, and they make their way up and down across the ledges until they reach the trough, where even more arduous climbing begins.
Above, the peak looks nearly vertical for 400 feet, and below, the most tremendous precipice I've ever seen descends in an unbroken fall. This is usually considered the most perilous part of the ascent, but it does not seem so to me, for such foothold as there is secure, and one fancies that it is possible to hold on with one's hand. But there, and on the final, and to my thinking the worst part of the climb, one slip, and a breathing, thinking human being would lie 3,000 feet below, a shapeless, bloody heap. Ring refused to traverse the ledge and remained at the lift, howling piteously.
Taking in the magnificent view from the Narrows, including even Pikes Peak 100 miles to the south, the party reaches what we now call the home stretch.
As we crept from the ledge round a corner of rock, I beheld what made me perfectly sick and dizzy to look at, the terminal peak itself, a smooth, cracked face or wall of pink granite, as nearly perpendicular as anything could well be, up which it was possible to climb, well deserving the name of the American Matterhorn. Scaling, not climbing, is the correct term for this last ascent. It took 1 hour to accomplish 500 feet, pausing for breath every minute or two. The only foothold was in narrow cracks or on minute projections on the granite. To get a toe in these cracks, or here and there on a scarcely obvious projection, while crawling on hands and knees, all the while tortured with thirst and gasping and struggling for breath. This was the climb, but at last the peak was won. A grand, well-defined mountaintop it is, a nearly level acre of boulders, with precipitous sides all round, the one we came up being the only accessible one. Uplifted above love and hate, storms of passion, calm amidst the eternal silences, fanned by zephyrs and bathed in living blue, peace rested for that one bright day on the peak, as if it were some region where falls not rain, nor hail, or any snow, or ever wind blows loudly.
They arrive on the summit and leave their names and the date of the ascent in a tin in a crevice, but do not stay long for want of water, the parched air producing bleeding from the lungs for one of the young men. And they still face the arduous trek back to Boulderfield, called Lava Beds at the time. Remember, this climb is in October, a month seldom attempted today.
We accomplished the descent of roughly 1,500 feet of ice and snow, with many falls and bruises, but no worse mishap, and there separated, the young men taking the deepest but most direct way to the notch, with the intention of getting ready for the march home, and Jim and I taking what he thought the safer route for me, a descent over boulders for 2,000 feet, and then a tremendous ascent to the notch. I had various falls, and once hung from my frock, which caught on a rock, and Jim severed it with his hunting knife, upon which I fell into a crevice, full of soft snow. We were driven lower down the mountains than he had intended by impassable tracts of ice, and the ascent was tremendous. For the last 200 feet, the boulders were of enormous size and the steepness fearful. Sometimes I drew myself up on hands and knees, sometimes crawled, sometimes Jim pulled me up by arms or a lariat, and sometimes I stood on his shoulders, or he made steps for me of his feet and hands. But at 6 we stood on the notch, in the splendour of the sinking sun, all colour deepening, all peaks glorifying, all shadows purpling, all peril past.
They passed from the notch and crossed the lava beds to rejoin the horses, stopping along the way to drink draughts of water from ice-covered spots, parched as they are. The men carry Miss Bird to her horse and lift her upon him, and when they reach their camping ground, they help her down and place her on the ground wrapped in blankets. The young men are ready to continue down, but Jim gently insists that they spend the night, noting that one of the young men is quite finished.
When I woke, the moon was high, shining through the silvery branches, whitening the bald peak above and glittering on the great abyss of snow behind. And pine logs were blazing like a bonfire in the cold, still air. My feet were so icy cold that I could not sleep again, and was getting some blankets to sit on, making a roll of them for my back. I sat for 2 hours by the campfire. It was weird and gloriously beautiful. The students were asleep not far off, in their blankets with their feet towards the fire. Ring lay on one side of me, with his fine head on my arm, and his master sat smoking, with the fire lighting up the handsome side of his face. And except for the tones of our voices and the occasional crackle and splutter as a pine knot blazed up, there was no sound on the mountainside. The beloved stars of my far-off home were overhead, the plough, the pole star, with their steady light, the glittering Pleiades, looking larger than I ever saw them, and Orion's studded belt shining gloriously. Jim, or Mr. Nugent, as I always scrupulously called him, told stories of his early youth and of a great sorrow which had led him to embark on a lawless and desperate life. His voice trembled, and tears rolled down his cheek. It was semi-conscious acting, I wondered, or was his dark soul really stirred to its depths by the silence, the beauty, and the memories of youth? We reached Estes Park at noon of the following day. A more successful ascent of the peak was never made, and I would not now exchange my memories of its perfect beauty and extraordinary sublimity for any other experience of mountaineering in any part of the world. Yesterday, snow fell on the summit, and it was to be inaccessible for 8 months to come.
150 years have passed since a Victorian English woman named Isabella Bird climbed Long's Peak. Fortunately for us all, her vivid description of the trek from her letter to Henrietta survives because it became part of the best-selling compilation of her letters, called A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, first published in 1879. If you have climbed Long's Peak, you can vividly see in your mind's eye the scene she describes so eloquently. If you have not climbed, her gorgeous prose invites you to this timeless experience. It is an early October day.